The technological, economic, and social transformations initiated by the Industrial Revolution only continued to intensify throughout the mid to late 19th century in Europe and the United States. The spread of mass manufacturing resulted in an increasingly capitalist economy based on the industrialism and sort of accumulation of wealth. These changes also led to increased urbanization as the rural poor flocked to cities to find work in factories. However, there were no labor laws in place, so they often endured poor and dangerous working conditions. Urban living conditions were also often quite bad due to overpopulation, poor sanitation, and minimal health care. While the growing middle class sought power and status to go with their new wealth, and government regulations led to minor reforms, the poor were quickly left behind. Additionally, the 19th century was an era of continued political turmoil. In 1848, revolts broke out in several European capitals, and the United States Civil War began in 1861. All the while, industrialists, merchants, professionals, the middle class, some governments, and national academies of art all served as sources of patronage for art, and we'll see artists really responding to these changes and turning their attention to current events and to early modern life. So in the mid to late 19th century, several fast-growing cities, including Paris, London, and New York, underwent large-scale changes to accommodate increasing populations of city dwellers and tourists. One of the most large-scale urban transformations occurred in Paris. So if you recall, throughout the 18th century, France was in a nearly constant state of political turmoil, undergoing a series of brutal civil rebellions and revolutions, and fighting battles against foreign powers. Then in 1848, after riots broke out over the poor living conditions in several French cities, Napoleon III, the great-nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and the emperor of the Second French Empire from 1852 to 1870, he issued widespread reforms. So much of the city had been constructed during the medieval period, and the streets were very narrow and winding. Now that had actually helped French citizens during the Revolution because they could pretty easily build these makeshift barricades across the maze-like streets and prevent French troops from advancing. Now, the riots of 1848 had essentially destroyed a large portion of Paris's central neighborhoods, and so Napoleon III commissioned Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann to oversee extensive urban renewal projects that would clean up the damage from the years of rebellion and really modernize the city of Paris. Haussmann first did away with the maze of narrow streets and imposed a new orderly grid of broad avenues, parks, and open places within the heart of Paris. He demolished whole neighborhoods, evicting poor citizens quickly and without exception so that he could install new, large, modern apartments and townhomes along wide, straight, tree-lined avenues much more suited for horse-drawn carriages and strolling pedestrians, as well as the imperial army if need be. Haussmann also brought clean water and modern sewer systems to the city. He built parks, hospitals, schools, prisons, asylums, civic buildings, and theaters, and he installed gas lanterns along the streets for the first time. And so while all of this was really great for the city, it was all also done at the expense of the poor, and Haussmann earned himself the nickname Haussmann the Demolisher. The centerpiece of this Parisian urban renewal project was Charles Garnier's Opera House at the intersection of several of Haussmann's new boulevards. The opera was designed with both pedestrian and vehicular traffic in mind, and it is accessible from several different directions. Garnier really capitalized on several new innovations of the Industrial Revolution to create this grand, ornate structure. In the late 18th century, engineers began using iron as a building material because it was stronger and lighter than hand-cut masonry. Engineers then quickly discovered that by mixing molten iron and carbon, you could create an even stronger, more rigid alloy that could be poured at a liquid state into a mold, resulting in prefabricated cast iron pieces, or if those pieces were heated until they were malleable, you could create kind of custom shapes, which we refer to as wrought iron. And so the refinement and sort of mass production of iron, and then later steel, this really helped to revolutionize architecture because the metals have a greater strength to weight ratio, and so they can span larger distances, and they are much more lightweight and sort of flexible enough to give without breaking. And so they can create much more spacious interiors without having to have a lot of supports within the middle. So during this period of time, iron was commonly used as a structural building material. However, it was not considered an aesthetically appealing material. So it was usually hidden away behind masonry walls that mimicked more traditional load-bearing architecture. And that is the case here at Garnier's Opera. So he's used a very modern cast iron internal frame, but he's hidden it behind this very lavish exterior that is truly a perfect example of historicism, that is sort of drawing inspiration from earlier historic models. The practice of historicism was highly encouraged by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, which was founded in 1816 to replace the previous French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. And its official art school, the École des Beaux-Arts, both of which really maintained the tight grip on the visual arts in France throughout the 19th century. And so because this style, this sort of historicism, was really promoted by the Académie des Beaux-Arts, it's sometimes referred to as the Beaux-Arts style, or even just the academic style. And so we'll see that in architecture. We'll also see it in other visual arts as well. But this is a good example of the academic style, or the Beaux-Arts style of architecture, using historicism. So with historicism, artists and architects were really elaborating on the classical and Gothic revivals that were spurred on by neoclassicism and romanticism, although they often, in architecture specifically, will refer to multiple historical periods or styles in a single work. So here, Garnier was looking to the previous French Baroque period as this kind of period of greatness, and he really sought to revive it, but he was also directly referencing the 17th century wing of the Louvre, which is an association meant to kind of assert the continuity of the French nation and really flatter Napoleon III by comparing him with King Louis XIV. So we have this massive facade that features a row of paired multicolored marble columns over an arcade, all below this huge copper dome with relief sculpted friezes and sculptural groupings. Sometimes this is also called the Second Empire style, or maybe a neo-Baroque style, because it is classically inspired, but it's not exact. It's very lavish. There's lots of decoration or ornamentation, all sort of to appeal to upper-class tastes. The opera's primary function was as a place of entertainment, suited for the emperor and his entourage and the upper echelons of the French society. And so the interior was really even more lavish than the exterior, with this Baroque grand marble staircase that led from the very opulent gilded grand foyer to the grand auditorium, which could seat maybe about 2,000 people. And so Garnier's opera was really further decorated with rich fabrics, chandeliers, mirrors, fine art paintings and sculptures, all of which was very sort of Versailles in the way that it transformed the space. And so the Paris Opera really would have been the place to be, the place to go and sort of see, and also the place to go and to be seen. In 1851, the City of London sponsored one of the first of more than 20 international fairs celebrating the innovations of industry and technology. The Great Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations was meant to really display Britain's own industrial and imperial power. Joseph Paxton, a greenhouse designer, was commissioned to build the centerpiece of the exhibition to house the other works of industry in Hyde Park, which is sort of in the heart of the City of London. So Paxton's structure, the Crystal Palace, was this stunning technological marvel, really designed to match those sort of inside of it in the other parts of the exhibition. And it really introduced these new kind of modern building techniques and aesthetics to the general public. He used mass-produced, prefabricated cast iron columns and girders to design this huge triple-storied structural skeleton with no exterior masonry or ornamentation to hide the industrial or utilitarian materials. The iron framework supported iron-framed glass panels measuring about 49 by 30 inches, which was the largest that could be mass-produced at the time. The panels were further supported by prefabricated wooden ribs and bars. And so because all the materials were prefab, Paxton's Crystal Palace was constructed by workers in a sort of assembly line style in about 5 months. And so the final structure was about 1,851 feet long, 408 feet wide, and about 108 feet tall at the apex. It enclosed about 18 acres and provided about 1 million square foot of exhibition space, all of which was really flooded with natural light. So the central vaulted space was really based on the design of new cast iron train stations, and it has, as you can see here in the illustration, encompassed this row of elm trees within the park, which were especially beloved by Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. And so by the end of the Great Exhibition, Paxton's Crystal Palace had been visited by more than 6 million people in just over 6 months. And so while the structure was hailed as a technological marvel, many people, and mostly architects and critics, were still very stuck on the neoclassical and sort of romantic styles, and so they didn't consider it to be a legitimate work of architecture. However, it was very well received by the general public, so much so that even though it was originally intended as a sort of temporary novelty, it was actually taken apart and rebuilt on another site, which is shown here in this photograph. And this is where it stayed until 1936, when it was destroyed by a fire. The expanding middle class in growing cities had more leisure time and money, so shopping for new clothes and mass-produced consumer goods became more entertainment than necessity, and consumers came to value being modern, and so they wanted to get their hands on all the newest things. These new commercial interests resulted in the development of a new type of store, the department store, which was designed with divided spaces for retail areas that offered various products all under one roof. Department stores also often incorporated restaurants, reading rooms, places for strolling, and other sort of social spaces. Le Bon Marché was the first department store in Paris, and in 1852 it moved into a new building which was designed by the architect Louis-Charles Boileau. And so by 1874, Le Bon Marché really encompassed almost an entire city block, so it was quite huge. And so on the exterior, it had a sort of classical masonry facade that hid away the iron infrastructure, very similar to Charles Garnier's Paris Opera. However, at Le Bon Marché, the spacious interior really flaunted the modern ironwork technology by incorporating iron columns and balconies and this huge, grand iron stairway, which was designed by another fellow architect, Gustave Eiffel, and it sort of connects the upper and lower floors. And so the new iron framework also allowed for these wide windows that faced the street on the ground level, and allowed stores to showcase their modern goods and the sort of modern people who were inside. In 1889, after his experience working with Boileau at Le Bon Marché, Gustave Eiffel was commissioned to design and build a monumental entrance gate for the Universal Exposition in Paris, another of these international fairs that sought to showcase the international industry and science, and also applied decorative and fine arts. However, this particular exposition also served as a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the First French Revolution. So Eiffel's aptly named Eiffel Tower. It's this wrought iron lattice tower that stands on 4 arched legs, and it's 984 feet tall. And so at this point in time, it was the tallest structure in the world by far. And so Eiffel, again, has capitalized on the advantages of modern industrial materials like iron with its sort of minimum weight and its maximum rigidity, and the use of prefabricated materials. Workers assembled prefab beams and girders on site, hammering some 2,500,000 rivets into pre-cut holes and arranging the pieces into triangular lattice-like designs that create this intricate balance of tension and compression and really allow all of the components to contribute to this integrated structural system of unparalleled lightness, strength, and design flexibility. Eiffel did not cover his skeletal tower with any sort of skin. Instead, he has allowed the wind to sort of pass through its openings, therefore reducing the forces that are acting upon the structure. Now, the initial response to the Eiffel Tower was mixed. Many, including Charles Garnier, sort of denounced it as a rather ugly feat of engineering, but not a work of serious architecture. In 1887, a group of writers, musicians, and artists wrote to Le Temps protesting the, quote, erection of the useless and monstrous Eiffel Tower, describing it as a, quote, black and gigantic factory chimney. Additionally, it cost about $1 million to make, which was an unheard of sum for something to cost at this time, and so many people were just sort of bewildered. Gustave Eiffel responded, however, saying, quote, I believe the tower will have its own beauty, end quote. And he also said, it will show that the French are not simply an amusing people, but also the country of engineers. So regardless of the mixed reactions, though, during the 1889 fair, the Eiffel Tower attracted more than 2 million visitors, many of which rode the newly invented elevator up to the top to get a panoramic view of the city of Paris. And so, as we know, the Eiffel Tower really became sort of an international symbol of modernity and kind of innovation. And today, it's also really a symbol of Paris itself. Henri Labrouste trained as an architect at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he really sought to combine the Academy's historicizing approach with the technological innovations of industrial engineering that were being implemented by architects like Eiffel, Boulot, and Paxton. Labrouste's reading room here at the Bibliothèque Nationale really sort of exemplifies this synthesis. The room is covered with this series of domes that are faced with bright white ceramic tiles and crowned with glass-covered oculi that allow natural light to flood into the space, all supported with these thin iron arches and columns that don't interrupt the spacious open interior. Labrouste has incorporated kind of classical detailing into the open space, which is all made possible through the use of industrial materials and creates this perfect blend of modern and historic. The first American architect to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris was Richard Morris Hunt, who was extremely dedicated to the practice of historicism, and he sought to really raise the standards of American architecture through his references to past styles like the Gothic, the French classical style, and styles of the Italian Renaissance. In his late career, Hunt was commissioned to supervise the design of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which commemorated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The exposition was intended to model the ideal American city, a clean, spacious, carefully planned, and classically styled city. Hunt designed a unified series of buildings in a single classical style, all alluding to ancient Greece and Republican Rome to reflect America's pride in its own democratic institutions and its emergence as a world power. Hunt oversaw several other architects and designers, and their collective works, nicknamed the White City, were meant to stand in contrast to America's many underplanned and overcrowded cities. However, these structures were actually temporary and constructed from a mixture of plaster and fibrous materials instead of masonry. And after the exposition was over, most of them were demolished. And so to me, that demolition is somewhat ironic, considering that we're sort of looking to and modeling not only our architecture but our society on these empires of classical antiquity and trying to sort of revive their timeless power, their sort of austerity, and their democracy to create this dream American city and kind of demonstrate our own power and cultural superiority. And yet we promptly demolished these symbols almost as quickly as they were built and just sort of moved on with our lives after the exposition was done. Now, by the 1890s, Chicago was one of the wealthier cities in America because it was a hub of transportation between the rural Midwest and the urbanized East and West coasts. And so we see a lot of sort of urban and functional architectural design innovation happening in Chicago. With rapid industrialization and urbanization underway, many modern cities, Chicago included, required new building types to be used for transportation, commerce, living, and other things. And that would also accommodate for overcrowding and rapidly rising costs of urban land. In the mid-19th century, new technology for producing steel, which is a stronger, cheaper alloy of iron, this really created new structural opportunities, and in combination with the invention of the elevator in the 1880s, urban architects began building up rather than out, designing tall buildings supported by skeletal steel frameworks. The Chicago School of Architects, which was not an actual school, but sort of the younger generation of architects within the city, they developed a new kind of building using this steel framework that we know now as the skyscraper. And so Louis Sullivan is perhaps one of the most prominent members of this Chicago school. Sullivan was born in Boston, and he studied at MIT, and then for a short time at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he developed a distaste for historicism. So it really wasn't his thing. His first major skyscraper was the Wainwright Building, which is in St. Louis, Missouri, and it was built in 1890 and 91, and it really sort of clearly articulates Sullivan's architectural philosophy, which was, quote, "form must ever follow function." And so by this he meant that the design of a structure must reflect the social purpose of the space. And so Sullivan argued that the ideal skyscraper should be divided into three sections. There should be a base level or ground floor for businesses that require easy public access with large plate glass windows for the display of merchandise. The second story, or the mezzanine, which would be accessible by stairways, also had very large windows that illuminated the shops and offices. These two sections should be followed by a section with really as many stories as you would like of offices. The Wainwright Building has 7 floors of offices, all designed to look the same because they all serve the same function. Finally, at the top, we have an attic section that houses the building mechanics and utilities. The building is highly functional, and the load-bearing steel framework has freed the walls from the load-bearing kind of necessity, and that really allows for more windows. However, Sullivan also includes decorative elements within his functionality. For example, he includes these thick corner piers and then thinner piers between windows that sort of emphasize the vertical thrust of the structure and echo the supportive steel beams within. Sullivan also argued that the ideal skyscraper should have a distinct cornice line that made it stand out from the other buildings within the city. And so here he's included this richly decorated frieze with sort of vegetal or organic designs that swirl around the top of the building like a Corinthian capital on a column. And so that gives us sort of a subtle hint of this lingering interest in classicism. In 1875, Sullivan moved to Chicago, probably at least in part because of the construction boom that was going on in an effort to rebuild the city after the disastrous Chicago fire of 1871. This is an important example of Sullivan's early Chicago skyscraper architecture that uses that steel frame construction. This is the Carson Peary Scott building, which is actually known today as the Sullivan Center. And it was a department store that was constructed in 2 phases, first in 1899 and then in 1903 and 04. And so it has this sort of bronze-colored ground floor and then a broad white facade that stretches for 12 stories above it. And so instead of the ordered simplicity of his previous buildings, this one highlighted the lower street level section, and especially the entryway to draw shoppers into the store. The windows on the ground floor displaying the store's products are much larger than those above, and the 3 doors of the main entrance were placed within a rounded bay at the corner of the site so that they were visible from all directions approaching the building. The corner entryway and the entire base section are differentiated from the spare upper stories by a unified system of extremely ornate decoration. The cast iron ornament contains the same highly complicated, delicate, organic, and floral motifs that had become hallmarks of Sullivan's design aesthetic and that we also saw at the Wainwright Building. For Sullivan, the decorative program served a functional project as well, to distinguish the building from those surrounding it and to make the store attractive to potential customers. The upper parts of the Carson Peary Scott building also reflect Sullivan's adaptation of his skyscraper theory to a department store. Each successive story of the white terracotta facade contains identical windows, in this case the sort of three-sectioned Chicago window common in the late 19th century. And then we also have this overhanging cornice at the very top that seems to signify the end of the building's ascent and makes the slightly setback attic level distinct from the broad midsection and the dark cast iron decoration of the base level. Unlike Sullivan's office buildings, however, the building's primary thrust is horizontal instead of vertical. Sullivan's designs really emphasize the long, uninterrupted lines that sort of run under each window from down the sides of the building towards the entry bay. And the decorative base at the bottom and the cornice line at the top kind of flow seamlessly around that rounded corner. And so with the elaborate decorative program and the attention paid to the functional requirements of retail architecture, Sullivan's design was a remarkably sort of successful display for the department store's products, even if it diverged from the wholly vertical effect of his earlier skyscrapers.